What happens when two of the most powerful voices in media sit down for what seems like a friendly chat, only for it to spiral into one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history? Tonight, we're breaking down the explosive interview between Oprah Winfrey and Jimmy Kimmel that ended with Oprah doing something nobody saw coming, walking straight off the set mid-conversation. Before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on in this whole situation. Trust me, you're going to have an opinion by the end of this. So the interview starts off innocently enough. Jimmy welcomes Oprah to thunderous applause from the audience, and she takes her seat with that signature warm smile everyone knows. The energy in the studio feels electric because these are two people who have essentially shaped modern media in their own ways. Jimmy starts with some light banter, asking about her latest projects, her book club selections, the usual softball questions you'd expect. Oprah answers graciously, sharing anecdotes about her recent interview subjects and what she's been working on. The audience is loving it, laughing at all the right moments, and everything seems to be going exactly as planned. But then Jimmy shifts gears. He brings up a topic that's been circulating in the media for weeks: the criticism Oprah faced regarding some of her past interview techniques and how certain guests felt they were treated unfairly. Now, this isn't new territory. Oprah has addressed criticism before with grace and thoughtfulness, but there's something in the way Jimmy phrases the question that feels different. He doesn't just ask for her perspective, he frames it almost like an accusation, suggesting that her approach might have been manipulative in certain situations. You can see Oprah's expression change slightly. That warm smile becomes more measured, more controlled. She takes a breath and responds professionally, explaining that journalism and interviewing is about getting to the truth, even when that truth makes people uncomfortable. She points out that she's always operated with integrity and that sometimes the questions that need to be asked aren't the ones people want to answer. The audience claps, seemingly satisfied with her response. But Jimmy doesn't let it go. He brings up a specific interview from years ago, one where a celebrity guest later claimed they felt ambushed by the line of questioning. Jimmy reads a quote from that guest, and the tone in the studio starts to shift. Oprah's posture straightens, and she asks Jimmy directly why he's bringing up something from so long ago, especially when that situation was resolved privately between her and that guest. Jimmy responds by saying that it's relevant to the conversation about interview ethics, and that as public figures, they both have a responsibility to address these things openly. This is where the temperature really starts to rise. Oprah counters by asking Jimmy if he's ever considered his own interview style, mentioning moments where his comedy has crossed into territory that made guests visibly uncomfortable. She doesn't name specific instances, but everyone watching knows what she's referring to. There have been viral clips over the years of Jimmy's interviews where the humor felt more like mockery than entertainment. The audience goes quiet, sensing that this has moved beyond a typical interview disagreement. Jimmy laughs it off initially, trying to bring levity back to the conversation, but Oprah isn't backing down. She says that if they're going to have a conversation about journalistic integrity and respect for guests, then it needs to be an honest conversation that includes everyone in the room. Jimmy's smile fades a bit, and he tells Oprah that he invited her on the show to have a genuine dialogue, not to be attacked. Oprah immediately pushes back on the word attacked, saying that holding up a mirror isn't an attack, it's accountability. The energy in the room is completely different now. What started as a friendly late-night interview has transformed into something far more intense. Jimmy tries to steer things back by asking Oprah about her future projects, clearly attempting to move past the uncomfortable exchange. But Oprah doesn't take the bait. She asks Jimmy why he's changing the subject when they were in the middle of an important discussion. She points out that this is exactly the problem with media today, that people want to ask difficult questions but aren't prepared to answer them themselves. Jimmy's tone becomes more defensive. He tells Oprah that his show is meant to be entertaining, that people tune in to laugh and unwind, not to watch heated debates about journalistic ethics. Oprah responds by saying that entertainment doesn't have to come at the expense of substance, and that maybe that's the difference between their approaches to media. She suggests that perhaps he's more concerned with keeping audiences comfortable than with challenging them to think critically. The audience is completely silent now, just watching this unfold. You can feel the discomfort radiating through the studio. Jimmy takes a moment, visibly frustrated, and says that he respects Oprah's legacy, but that she's being unfair. He argues that his show has featured countless important conversations over the years, and that just because he uses humor as a tool doesn't mean he's not serious about meaningful content. Oprah nods slowly, then asks him if he really believes that, or if he's just saying it because he knows that's what he's supposed to say. That question hangs in the air like a challenge. Jimmy doesn't answer right away. Instead, he looks at his notes, looks back at Oprah, and then says something that escalates everything to a new level. He tells Oprah that maybe the real issue is that she's used to being the one in control, the one asking the questions, and that sitting on the other side of the table is revealing something about how she handles scrutiny. He suggests that for someone who has built a career on getting others to open up, she seems remarkably closed off when the spotlight turns on her. Oprah's face hardens. She asks Jimmy if he's seriously psychoanalyzing her on national television and whether he thinks that's appropriate or professional. Jimmy responds that she was the one who started making this personal by questioning his integrity and his approach to his own show. He says that if she can't handle a tough interview, then maybe she shouldn't be so quick to judge others for how they react when they're in the hot seat. The tension is unbearable at this point. Oprah sits back in her chair, and for a moment it looks like she might be collecting her thoughts to deliver a measured response. But instead, she does something unexpected. She asks Jimmy point blank if this was his plan all along, to bring her on the show under the guise of a friendly conversation and then ambush her with accusations and criticism. Jimmy denies it immediately, saying that he's simply responding to the direction she took the conversation. Oprah shakes her head slowly, a look of disappointment crossing her face. She tells Jimmy that this is beneath him, beneath both of them really, and that what's happening right now is exactly what's wrong with the media landscape. She says they're supposed to be better than this, supposed to model respectful discourse even when they disagree. Jimmy argues back that respectful discourse goes both ways, and that she came onto his show and immediately started criticizing him. The back and forth continues, both of them speaking over each other at points, their voices rising slightly though neither is shouting. Oprah brings up the responsibility they have as people with platforms, the influence they wield over public opinion and cultural conversations. Jimmy counters that she can't claim moral high ground when she's been just as willing to engage in spectacle and controversy when it served her purposes. The audience watches in stunned silence, nobody quite sure what to do or how this is going to end. Then, Oprah says something that cuts through everything. She tells Jimmy that she came on this show in good faith, believing they could have an interesting and mutually respectful conversation, but that clearly, that's not what this is. She says she's not interested in participating in whatever this has become, this performance of conflict, for the sake of ratings and viral clips. Jimmy tries to interject, to defend himself, but Oprah holds up her hand and continues speaking. She says that she's spent decades building trust with audiences, creating spaces where honest and vulnerable conversations can happen, and that she's not going to compromise that by engaging in what feels like a setup designed to create drama. Jimmy's face flushes, and he insists again that this wasn't a setup, that she's mischaracterizing what's happening. But Oprah is already reaching for her microphone, beginning to unclip it from her outfit. The camera captures every second of this moment, the confusion on Jimmy's face, the absolute shock rippling through the audience. The way Oprah's movements are deliberate and calm, despite the chaos of the situation. She stands up, and Jimmy quickly stands too, asking her to please sit back down so they can talk through this like adults. Oprah responds that she is handling this like an adult by recognizing when a situation is no longer productive and removing herself from it. Jimmy makes one more attempt, reaching out as if to guide her back to her seat, telling her that they can reset, start fresh, move past this disagreement. But Oprah is already walking toward the edge of the stage. The studio audience doesn't know how to react. Some people are gasping, others are sitting in complete silence. A few are looking around, as if waiting for someone to tell them this is all part of some elaborate bit. But the look on Jimmy's face makes it clear this is very real. He's standing there, one hand slightly extended, his expression a mixture of panic and disbelief. The band has stopped playing. The energy in the room has shifted from entertainment to something far more uncomfortable. And all eyes are on Oprah as she reaches the steps leading off the stage. Jimmy calls out to her, his voice carrying across the studio. He says they should finish the conversation, that walking away doesn't solve anything. Oprah pauses, turning back to face him from the edge of the stage. She tells him that some conversations aren't meant to be finished on camera, that not everything needs to be turned into content for an audience. Jimmy argues that they started this in front of an audience, and that leaving now just creates more questions and more controversy than actually working through their disagreement would. Oprah takes a few steps back towards center stage, but she doesn't sit down. She stands there, arms crossed, and asks Jimmy what he really wants from this moment. Does he want an apology? Does he want her to concede that she was wrong? Jimmy looks genuinely thrown by the question. He says he wants them to have an honest conversation. That's all he's ever wanted. Oprah laughs, but there's no humor in it. She says that if he wanted honesty, he wouldn't have framed their discussion the way he did, using loaded questions designed to put her on the defensive. Jimmy takes a step toward her, his hands open in a gesture of reconciliation. He tells her that she's reading intentions into his words that weren't there. He says that as someone who has conducted thousands of interviews, she should understand that sometimes questions are difficult not because they're attacks, but because they're necessary. Oprah counters by saying that there's a difference between asking difficult questions and asking questions designed to humiliate or diminish someone. The audience is watching this play out like a tennis match, heads turning back and forth between the two of them. Jimmy asks Oprah to tell him specifically what question crossed the line. Oprah says it's not about one specific question, it's about the overall tone and approach. She says that from the moment he brought up the criticism of her interview style, it felt less like genuine curiosity and more like an attempt to score points. Jimmy's expression hardens. He tells Oprah that maybe she's so used to being celebrated and praised that any form of critical examination feels like an attack. Oprah's eyes narrow, and she asks Jimmy if he realizes what he just did. She points out that instead of addressing her actual concern, he's now attempting to dismiss her feelings by suggesting she's too sensitive to handle scrutiny. This observation seems to land differently. Jimmy pauses, processing what she said. He says that wasn't his intention, but Oprah interrupts him. She says that intention doesn't erase impact, and that this is something people in media need to understand better. Jimmy argues that there has to be room for miscommunication, for people to make mistakes and learn from them without being completely condemned. Oprah agrees with that in principle, but notes that accountability still matters. She asks Jimmy what he's willing to take accountability for in this situation. Jimmy stands there for a moment, then finally says that he can acknowledge his defensiveness. But then he adds that she needs to acknowledge her part in this too, that she immediately went on the attack when he asked about criticism she's received. Oprah considers this, tilting her head slightly. She tells him that there's some truth to that maybe she did react more strongly than the situation required initially. This moment of mutual acknowledgement seems to shift something in the room. The tension doesn't disappear completely, but it changes quality somehow. Jimmy's posture becomes less defensive. He tells Oprah that he has tremendous respect for her work and that he genuinely didn't bring her on the show to embarrass her. Oprah listens, her expression softening slightly. She asks him what happens now, whether they just pretend this didn't happen, or whether they actually use this moment to demonstrate something different. Jimmy asks what she has in mind. Oprah says that maybe instead of performing for an audience, they could model what it looks like to disagree respectfully and work through conflict in real time. Jimmy seems intrigued but uncertain. Oprah suggests they both sit back down and have a real conversation about what just happened between them. Jimmy asks if she's really willing to do that in front of cameras and a live audience. Oprah says she's willing if he is, but that it requires both of them to be genuinely open and vulnerable, not performing or trying to win. Jimmy agrees, and they both move back toward their seats. The audience seems confused about whether they should applaud or stay silent, so there's this awkward smattering of claps that quickly dies out. Jimmy and Oprah sit down, and there's a moment where they just look at each other, silently agreeing to really commit to what they're about to do. Jimmy starts by admitting that he sometimes uses humor as a shield, that when conversations get uncomfortable, he retreats into jokes because it feels safer. Oprah thanks him for that honesty and shares that she struggles with being on the receiving end of questions because she's so used to being the one in control. She admits that being interviewed can trigger insecurities about how she's perceived. This exchange feels completely different from everything that came before. The audience is leaning in now, genuinely engaged. Jimmy asks Oprah about the specific criticism mentioned earlier, the guest who felt ambushed. Oprah takes a breath and talks about that interview more openly, explaining the context and acknowledging that in hindsight, she might have approached things differently. Jimmy shares his own experience with interviews that went wrong, moments where his humor missed the mark. They find common ground in discussing how difficult it is to navigate public perception, how one moment can be clipped and shared without context. The conversation shifts as they discuss accountability, how social media has changed everything, the challenge of maintaining standards while allowing people room to grow. Jimmy asks Oprah how she's maintained relevance for so many decades. She laughs genuinely for the first time since the conflict began, saying it's been trial and error, learning from mistakes. She talks about the importance of listening to criticism even when it's hard to hear. Jimmy reflects on times he's had to apologize publicly, how difficult but necessary that vulnerability is. Oprah says that leadership in media means modeling the behavior you want to see. If they want audiences to be thoughtful and engaged, they have to demonstrate those qualities themselves, even when it's uncomfortable. Jimmy points out that what they're doing right now is risky because they're both being open about their flaws. Oprah says that risk is exactly what makes it valuable, that too much of media has become about projecting perfection rather than seeking understanding. They both acknowledge that people will clip and interpret moments however they want, that it's impossible to control perception. Oprah says you can only control your actions and intentions. She tells Jimmy that, despite their rocky start, she believes his intentions are good, and his willingness to engage demonstrates that. Jimmy thanks her and says he's learned a lot from this experience, painful as parts of it were. Oprah tells him she'll probably approach being interviewed differently too, that this has reminded her how vulnerable it feels to be on the receiving end of tough questions. She says empathy goes both ways, that both interviewers and subjects need to remember they're dealing with human beings. Jimmy agrees, adding that the stakes feel higher than ever because everything is recorded and shared, but that can't be an excuse to avoid difficult conversations. The conversation winds down naturally, both of them seeming tired but somehow lighter. Jimmy asks if there's anything else she wants to say before they close out. Oprah thinks for a moment, then says she hopes people watching will take away the idea that conflict doesn't have to be destructive, that disagreement can lead to deeper understanding if people are willing to stay in the conversation and do the work. Jimmy nods, taking in what Oprah just said, and there's a visible shift in his demeanor. He looks out at the audience, then back at Oprah, and says that what they just did, working through their disagreement in real time, is something more people need to see. Oprah agrees, adding that the culture of always being right, of never showing weakness, is exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. She says that some of the most powerful moments in media come from admitting you don't have all the answers. Jimmy listens intently and says that he wishes he was better at being comfortable with not knowing or not being in control of where a conversation goes. Oprah tells him that it's a practice, not something you just master overnight. Every conversation is an opportunity to get better at listening, at being present, at setting ego aside. Jimmy brings up something that's clearly been on his mind. He says that one of the things that scared him most was the fear that people would see him as a bad person, as someone who attacked Oprah Winfrey. He admits that his defensiveness came partly from wanting to protect his reputation. Oprah softens hearing this, telling him that she understands that fear intimately, that everyone in the public eye grapples with it constantly. She shares that early in her career, she was terrified of making mistakes, of being judged harshly. It took years for her to learn that trying to be perfect for everyone is impossible and ultimately inauthentic. Jimmy says that's a lesson he's still learning, that he sometimes gets so caught up in trying to please everyone that he loses sight of being genuine and doing work that has integrity. Oprah asks Jimmy what he wants his legacy to be. He takes a moment to consider, then says he wants to be remembered as someone who brought joy to people, but also wasn't afraid to tackle important topics when it mattered. Balancing entertainment and substance is something he's constantly trying to figure out. Oprah tells him there's no perfect formula, that the important thing is being intentional about your choices and being willing to evolve. Jimmy asks Oprah how she learned to trust her own judgment in the face of so much external noise. Oprah says it came from making mistakes and having to own them, from being humbled by her own missteps. Jimmy reflects on his own mistakes and says some of his biggest regrets came from moments where he knew something didn't feel right, but went along with it anyway because it was easier. Oprah tells him that the most meaningful growth happens when you're willing to have difficult conversations, to stand by your principles, even when it's uncomfortable. Jimmy says this conversation is a perfect example of that it would have been so much easier to just let her walk off, but this ended up being more valuable than anything they could have planned. The audience begins to applaud softly, something more thoughtful and genuine than before. Both Jimmy and Oprah acknowledge it with small smiles. Jimmy says he hopes this inspires others to approach their own conflicts differently. Oprah says that's her hope too, that people will see it's possible to disagree strongly with someone and still find common ground. The current climate often feels so polarized that people forget there's nuance and complexity in most situations. Oprah tells Jimmy that awareness is the first step, that you can't do better until you know better. She's made plenty of mistakes over the years, but beating yourself up over past mistakes doesn't help anyone. What matters is what you do moving forward. Jimmy says he tends to be pretty hard on himself when he messes up. Oprah asks him why he struggles to give himself the same grace he'd extend to others. Jimmy pauses, caught off guard. He says maybe because he feels like he should know better by now. Oprah smiles and tells him that as long as you're growing and taking risks, you're going to make mistakes. The day you stop making mistakes is probably the day you stop trying new things. Jimmy says he never thought about it that way, that mistakes are actually a sign of growth rather than failure. Jimmy says vulnerability is terrifying for him, that his instinct is always to deflect with humor. Oprah tells him those walls sometimes keep out the very connections that make life meaningful. Jimmy considers this and says some of his most regrettable moments have come from being too defended, too unwilling to let people in. Oprah says something that shifts the energy once more. She tells Jimmy that she's grateful this happened, that as difficult as it was, she feels like they both grew from it. These are the kinds of conversations that actually matter. Jimmy looks genuinely touched, telling her that being wrong about how this would go ended up being the best thing that could have happened. Oprah laughs and says, "Life has a way of teaching you what you need to learn through experiences you didn't plan for." Jimmy asks if there's any final wisdom she wants to share. Oprah thinks for a moment, then says she'd encourage everyone to approach conflicts with curiosity rather than defensiveness. When someone challenges you, try to understand what's underneath their words. Jimmy adds that he'd tell people to be willing to admit when they're wrong, that there's incredible power in being able to say, "You made a mistake." Oprah says she couldn't agree more. She stands up, and Jimmy stands with her. They shake hands, but then Oprah pulls him into a brief hug, which gets a warm response from the audience. It's a genuine moment of reconciliation. Jimmy tells the audience this was not how he expected this interview to go, but that he's grateful it went the way it did. Oprah says she feels the same way. Jimmy thanks her for being willing to stay and work through their disagreement, and Oprah says she's glad she did, that it would have been easier to walk away, but it wouldn't have been better. They exchange a few more words of gratitude, and then Oprah waves to the audience before making her exit, this time with genuine warmth. Jimmy watches her go, then turns back to the audience. He takes a deep breath and says he's not entirely sure what just happened, but he feels different somehow, like he learned something important. It's scary to be that vulnerable on television, but maybe that's what's been missing from media lately, that willingness to be real even when it's uncomfortable. He thanks the audience for sticking with them, and they give him a standing ovation. As the applause continues, Jimmy says this is why he loves live television, because sometimes those unplanned moments end up being the most meaningful ones. He reflects on how quickly things escalated, how close they came to ending things badly, and how ultimately they found a way to turn conflict into connection. So there you have it, one of the most unexpected interviews in late-night television history. What started as a potential disaster turned into something profound. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. What did you think about how Oprah and Jimmy handled this situation? Would you have stayed and worked through it, or would you have walked away? Let us know your thoughts.